Greetings. I would like to welcome the speakers and our audience to this event organized by the Institute Nicos Poulantzas in collaboration with the Transform Institute. My name is George Taremas, and I will be the moderator of the present discussion. Our panel theme focuses on state theory and public administration. I would like to say a few introductory remarks. The role of the state as a power complex and its impact on socioeconomic development in late modern capitalist societies is perhaps the most critical issue for left theory today. As Nicos Poulantzas, drawing upon Marx, has emphasized, the state is not a mere instrument of the ruling class, but it possesses relative autonomy from the forces of capital, condensing both class relations in its makeup and constituting an arena of class struggle in its very substance. Under the pressure of globalization, the modern nation-state, on the one hand, forfeits major aspects of its sovereignty, and on the other hand, adopts ever-increasing authoritarian forms, undermining its democratic character and intensifying the crisis of political representation. At the same time, the state and its administrative structures are called upon to function as both a force of social integration of society and as a vehicle of socioeconomic development, not only regulating, but also actively intervening in the capitalist economy, contrary to the prevailing neoliberal discourse. Left theory insists that a democratically self-governing state must deepen its democratization of institutional life, decentralize political power and decision-making processes, be the harbinger of public investment, address the deficiencies of the market and harness the proliferating monopolies and oligopolies, mitigate the ever-increasing social inequalities, deploy a robust, inclusive welfare state, enforce strategies of social redistribution, and operate as an innovator in policy formation and implementation. The dramatic experience of Syriza, the acronym stands for Coalition of Radical Left in Government, its experience in government, addressed by our panelists, surely has much to teach us about the conditions of possibility and the impediments faced by any left endeavor to promote societal transformation in an emancipatory direction. We will start our discussion with the first panelist, Professor Peter Bratis. The title of his talk is The Failures of Syriza and the Antinomies of Left Politics in Liberal Societies. Professor Peter Bratis is an associate professor of political science at the City University of New York, CUNY. His publications include the books Everyday Life and the State, and co-authored with Stanley Aronovich, Paradigm Lost, State Theory Reconsidered. He's an editor of the journal Situations, Project of the Radical Imagination. We welcome Mr. Bratis to initiate our panel.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you and Vinay and of course, Costa and Michalis for organizing this panel and the conference. I know it takes thousands of emails, who knows, 4,000 or 5,000 emails and many hours of planning to put something like this together. And it's greatly appreciated. And of course, for inviting me to participate as well. I would like to say a few things about Leo Panitch, to whom, of course, the conference is dedicated. I had the good fortune of knowing Leo for 20-something years, and I think the last time I saw him was in Greece on the island of Kassos last summer, the summer of 2019. We had the conference there, and we spent some days, eating good food and discussing Marxism, and it was a wonderful experience with him. And I don't think there's anyone in the North America, let's say, who was a closer friend of the Greek left than Leo. I remember the day that Syriza won in January of 2015. He called me, and I was shocked as to how happy he was. It was, his voice on the phone was so happy. It was, I felt a little bit guilty. Oh, maybe I should be more happy. So I think there's no greater, was no greater friend to the Greek left than Leo. And of course, it's a great loss for all of us that his passing away from COVID, in the middle of this huge crisis that we don't know the outcome, what the world will be like at this point. There's a close link between the rise of Syriza and state theory, because as Syriza, people became aware of Syriza following its electoral rise, after 2009, 2010, an eventual victory in 2015. Many people turned to state theory in an attempt to try to figure out, well, A, what is Syriza about? And B, what are the broader political and conceptual issues at hand in this phenomenon of the Syrizas and the radical left's rise in Greek politics. And of course, the main source they turned to was the work of Nicos Poulantzas. Again, in part because Poulantzas was a member of one of the precursors, the main precursor to Syriza, Kukuku, the Communist Party of the Interior. And it's unfortunate in a sense that the place where many people turned, or the initial point of departure for trying to understand Syriza, was the last part of Poulantzas's final book, State Power Socialism, which includes that famous section on the democratic transition to socialism. And there were many, many, many debates, and there continue to be debates, but especially in those years of 2012 through 2015-16, about the radical potentialities of Syriza. Should we support Syriza or not? Should we support electoral politics or not? Can this democratic road to socialism be successful? And it seemed to me to be a misplaced discussion, because I didn't then, and it should be even more obvious now, I didn't see as the issue, what are the mechanisms for transitioning to socialism? It didn't seem to me that the key issue was how we're going to now create socialism. It wasn't as if, even in Greece, certainly, between 2008, 9, and 2015, suddenly we had the plurality of people who had become communists. The fact that Syriza was able to win elections does not mean that people were voting for a transition to socialism. Certainly the broader conditions were not conducive to such a project. If anything, I think it would be more appropriate to say that politics was becoming more bleak and turning to the right rather than turning to the left throughout this moment. And Greece was a bit of an outlier, an anomaly globally, because rather than there be, as a political accompaniment to the economic crises, turned to the right, there was the rise of Syriza, which was certainly not, it still is, of course, a left-wing party. It was not a conservative force. So there was a return to state theory. I think there are many better questions we can ask, or better places we can turn to within the tradition of state theory, rather than Poulantzas' final essay, which again was written in 1978. It was a very different context, the transition to democracy in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and the real possibility then of there being a socialist regime by way of electoral politics. In Portugal, mostly, Portugal came the closest to doing it. Spain, the worst in a sense. They still have Francoists. The Francoists were still, quite powerful and quite consequential in Spanish politics. Greece was somewhere in the middle. But 1978 and 2015 were, in many ways, very far apart in terms of the political possibilities of that moment. I think from the Poulantzas' final book, the section that would have been and is more interesting to go back to try to understand what happens with Syriza and in the context of this economic and political crisis in Greece and beyond, certainly it's not exclusive to Greece, is his concept of authoritarian statism. And in one of his more prophetic moments, certainly, Poulantzas understood even then, and certainly the first manifestations of that were Thatcherism in the UK and then Reaganism. And because of the financial crisis, the fiscal crisis of the state, that severely limited the possibilities in terms of new social spending and programs. And on the other hand, a very great rigidity of the institutions of the state, an increasing bureaucratization, an increasing privileging of executive over legislative and other forms of power within the state. We had reached a point for this, let's say, capitalism, where legitimacy could no longer be easily reproduced through social democratic means. The response to the social movements in the United States in the 1960s, for example, was to spend a lot more money. It was to, for example, I have a job at the City University and many other people have jobs because public education, higher education in the United States was greatly expanded in the mid-60s to the mid-70s with the idea it's better to build universities and put young people in schools rather than have them on the streets discontented and causing trouble. So it was in part a political response to the upheavals as a way to pacify them. There was, of course, also the war on poverty under the Johnson administration, as in a way to produce legitimation and to reproduce the social relations of production in the United States. From the late 70s, early 80s onwards, there's the tendency, of course, for that to be more and more and more unlikely, and the means of securing the reproduction of the system become more authoritarian, more coercive, rather than spending money to build prisons and to hire more police and so forth. So this was certainly a tendency that the state becomes less capable of fulfilling its function as a factor of cohesion and as that segment of reproduction than it had been in the past. And I think here maybe we can add as a caveat the many, many debates about whether one should be inside or outside the state, whether one should be in favor of reform or revolution, is largely inconsequential, I think, from the tradition of state theory, especially Poulantzas, Gramsci, and others, because for them, the state is ubiquitous. You cannot be involved in politics and be outside the state, And it's also a measure of efficacy, for Poulantzas. If the class struggle happens, if it's of any consequence, it has as an index of that what he would call as one of the pertinent effects of the struggle, a transformation of the institutions. When Poulantzas says that the institutional materiality of the state is a condensation of class struggles, it is the residue, the effect of the struggle, and that it itself, of course, has its own efficacy, its own impact on the struggles of the future. And movements that may be revolutionary in their intent may end up creating reforms. That's certainly true. And movement revolution. That's another issue, but there's no strategic decision to be made. Should we focus on the state or not? Should we worry about what happens? Because whether it's simply movements on the streets, if they are successful, it will have an effect on state power, on these institutional mediations of power. So in this context, I think, of authoritarian statism that builds from the late 70s, early 80s onwards, the Greek then crisis from 2009 onwards is maybe one of the most clear examples of this authoritarian statism, because the fiscal crisis is that we cannot add to social spending, but indeed there are huge cuts that are made to social spending, pensions, wages, and so forth. And at the same time, the bureaucratic rigidity of the Greek state, the inability to respond to social pressures from below from the Greek state is extremely high, in part because the institutional materiality of the Greek state now includes the European Union. So even you have a significant component of the Greek state that is external to Greece and set up in a way so as to minimize the possibilities of popular sovereignty and all the rest. It's from the 90s onwards that it's not only, of course, the treaties and the common institutions within the European Union that create this kind of rigidity. There are many, many popular political movements. The attack on clientelism, let's say, domestically in Greece, in populism. I think the attacks on clientelism and populism are fundamentally an attempt to reduce to increase the autonomy of the state from the popular classes in Greece. Because for all of its problems, of which of course there are a great many, clientelism is first and foremost a form of articulation between the popular classes and state power. Same thing, of course, with populism. Oh, very fast, huh? Same, of course, with populism. Populism is fundamentally, what is the problem with populism? The problem with populism is that people demand things, and if the state provides it, then we're in trouble. Many people, of course, there was the famous line that we ate it together, from Pangalos, that the crisis is because, well, people asked for things and we gave it to them, and that's the cause of this. Populism or too much democracy is the cause of the crisis, and that's what we have to overcome. So I think this was the fundamental problem, the conceptual, the political problem in the Syriza experiment, in the context of this authoritarian statism, in this context of an increasing disembeddedness of markets from society, of state from popular participation and popular power. Would winning an election, would being, constituting the actual regime within the state, would that be enough to once again reactivate the responsiveness, the reaction of the state to popular pressure? And here the question is not a transition to socialism. Here the question is politics possible in the era of what some people call neoliberalism? I prefer the term late liberalism, because liberalism hasn't changed. What has changed is external competitors, let's say, or the external environment, that now all you have is liberalism. So this was the experiment. And I think the answer is it was not successful in the case of Greece and Syriza. I think there are multiple reasons for this. The main reason is that there was a lot of fear and trepidation of going too far, of attempting to impose the popular will over the markets, over transnational capital and the rest. Because there's a fundamental contradiction. If the stated goal of Syriza and of the Greek population was to undo austerity, if the fundamental problem of the crisis was that people suffer because of economic hardships, to then say the solution is to break off from or challenge the power of transnational capital, and one of the likely consequences would be that the economic crisis could be even deeper, that there would be even more, a deeper cut to economic activity. It is an impossibility. You know, I remember when I was, at that point, I was on the, I had been the OHI representative, you know, to oversee the thing on the island of Costas. And I would call some of my friends who were then members of parliament to see what was going on. And the people were very much afraid. The idea was if we press further, it will be like Chile in 1973. Or if we press further, you won't have water to drink because the ferry boats will be stopped and they won't bring water to the island and you won't even have water to drink and so forth. So this is really the fundamental limit.
Interrupt you, but you have just 2 minutes to wrap up, let's say, and you can expand in the discussion after the presentation.
Thank you very much. And and here I think we see a great divide. If we think back to some of the heroes of the Greek left, someone like Manolis Glezos, for example, you know, the ethic, the ethos that makes Glezos a hero is that he didn't, you know, it was a suicidal move to climb to the top of the Acropolis to take down the flag. It's crazy in a sense. You know, okay, what are you going to do? You take down the flag, so what? And they will shoot you and kill you, and you'll be dead. And what's the problem? But it's exactly that, of course, that makes him someone to be admired. And then the many, many, many more, of course, who were collaborators or who played along. You know, the collaboration is not because they are on the far right per se and they are in deep agreement with the Nazis, is because they care about their self-interests. They want to survive. It's the logic of survival, of not unnecessarily suffering. Now, it's understandable, but it's certainly not something that we think to be virtuous or honorable, that someone puts their self-interests above other issues. But in the liberal world, there is no higher value than self-interest. And this really, I think, was what we don't know what would have been possible had Syriza risked things. If the dice were rolled, if the state bureaucracies would have intervened, what would have been possible, what would have been impossible. We never reached that point because of fear and trepidation and the dominance of the liberal ethic and ethos.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Professor Bratis. I will just need, I think, to summarize, let's say, your points. Perhaps we will discuss that by the end of the presentations. Let us proceed now to Mrs. Danae Koltsida, who is a lawyer and political scientist, and she is currently the director of Nicos Poulantzas Institute, and a member, of course, of the board. And she is also a vice president of Transform Europe Network. She has a long experience in executive positions in the Ministry of the Interior during the, let's say, political regime of Syriza. And she's going to talk to us about left strategies for reconstituting democracy, the experience that we can gather from the Greek case. You have the forum, dear Danai.
Thank you, Yorgos, and thanks to my colleagues for inviting me to this panel. Good afternoon, everybody. As a democracy, the idea came to me while reviewing the material we gathered for the research program Left Government Experiences that I coordinate on behalf of Nicos Poulantzas Institute, because it seemed to me that the question of democracy appears to be central to all discussion around this experience. Following Aristidis Baltasis' remark this morning, my aspirations are moderate. I will not propose a theory, but rather describe and generalize the experience of Syriza on this matter. Luckily, I can take it exactly from where Akis left it right before. So let me begin. We all know from academic and political literature that the so-called crisis of democracy is a rather universal and long-standing phenomenon for Western democracies. Given, however, the fact that Greece found itself in the epicenter of the economic crisis during the past decade, I will try to answer two questions. On the one hand, what form did the crisis of democracy take in the Greek case, and what was the impact of austerity policies imposed to Greece? And on the other hand, how did Syriza try to respond to this crisis, and what was the impact of its governance on the current status of democracy and democratic politics in Greece? For the purposes of my analysis, I will use a threefold distinction of the elements of democracy in, let's say, traditional definition. First, the constitutional element, meaning the checks and balances between institutions, the parliamentarian processes, the procedural judiciary rules, etc. It is what we could say the external, the typical or procedural aspect of democracy. Second, the liberal element, meaning the recognition and effective protection of rights and liberties. And third, the popular element, meaning the majoritarian principle and the effective participation of the people to the decision-making processes, or what Akis just said about imposing the people's wills over the markets and turning it into the decisive factor. The core of what we call crisis of democracy is exactly the restriction or even the elimination of the popular element. As Peter Mayer described it, this is usually manifested as a growing indifference of the citizens vis-à-vis politics on the social level, and as a tendency to transmit power from democratically elected and controlled bodies to independent or depoliticized. Democracy is diminished to a form of constitutional liberalism, as Zakaria defined it, or a democracy without a demos, as the latter is no longer considered essential to the former. This was particularly clear in the case of Greece. For many years in the post-dictatorship era, Greece followed a path similar to the rest of the Western world. A gradual transition to what was described as a convergent two-party system took place. The process of Europeanization brought both the right and the left-wing dominant parties of the time closer to each other, and the modernization project, the Greek version of pluralism, dominated the Greek political life in the late 90s and the early 2000s. This was also reflected to the political behavior of the Greeks. Within 2 decades, electoral turnout dropped by almost 2 million voters in a country with no more than 8 million voters in total. Similarly, interest for politics, party membership, and all other indexes dropped as well. However, Greece started experiencing severe challenges for its democracy after the imposition of the austerity policies and the consecutive memoranda at the beginning of the last decade. The attack against the popular element of the democracy became open and violent. All social demands were collectively accused as populistic. The left was presented as similar to the far right. Elections were perceived as trouble or danger, and the democratically elected Prime Minister Yorgos Papandreou was forced to step down in order for a technocrat Lukas Papadimos to take over. Vote to parties that opposed memoranda, and especially Syriza, were openly and officially described as a dangerous and catastrophic choice. Constitutional liberalism was also threatened. On the constitutional level, luckily, the Greek constitution proved to be resilient. However, it went through severe challenges. To mention just a few examples, there was a clear abuse of the constitutional provision for legislative decrees in cases of emergency, 2012 being the most characteristic year of this phenomenon. There was also limited function of the parliament and violation of all guidelines for what is called qualitative legislation. The most characteristic example is the fact that laws of hundreds of pages were designed to have only one article in order for MPs to be unable to vote against one single provision. The Prime Minister, and to a lesser extent the ministers, rarely appeared in front of the Parliament in order to answer questions of opposition, etc. Of course, the liberal element found itself also under threat. Excessive police violence and impunity of officers that misbehaved were an everyday phenomenon. Several pieces of ultra-conservative legislation were adopted, for example, the law on maximum security prisons, anti-immigrant legislation, etc. National radio and television were forced to close. And to the social level, the neo-Nazi far right, the Golden Dawn, often worked, although not by, I guess not by a governmental plan and order, as a supplementary mechanism of oppression. We can see, for example, the attacks in popular neighborhoods of Perama, the targeting of trade unionists, and the collaboration with the police during protests, etc. The rise of Syriza to power, both before and after 2015, proved to be important for the status of democracy in Greece. Although this experience should be examined as a whole, I tried to distinguish for a better understanding the case, three periods. The first period, from 2011 until December of 2014, was the period of grand battles over democracy. Syriza actively participated in the movement and was the protagonist of several political and/or symbolic battles over democracy, both in and outside the parliament. The two most important moments were, beyond any doubt, the movement of Aganaktismeni, the Greek version of Indignados, in 2011, and the protests against the shutdown of the public radio and television of ERT in 2013. Also, the very presence of Syriza to the political forefront revived and repoliticized the public discourse, and it created a new polarization on new or on renewed cleavages. Most importantly, it revived the cleavage between left and right. Besides, even the attacks against Syriza are revealing, as two of the main accusations were about the party's populism and about its lack of excellence and expertise on governing. The first months of the Syriza government, from January 2015 until the signature of the third memorandum, can be described as a new governmental attitude, since the impact of the government shift had strong symbolic connotations and even some tangible practical results regarding the restoration of democracy. Some indications. First of all, from the beginning, negotiations with the Troika were brought to the public sphere and were conducted on behalf of the government using not only economic but also political arguments. Second, parliamentary procedures were respected and revived. Third, phenomena of police violence and oppression halted. Fourth, the conservative legislation of the previous years was abolished, and even in this short period, some new laws were adopted. I will come back to this later. And most importantly, the question of popular sovereignty became central. During the negotiations with the Troika, with the 2015 referendum, the importance of which is not yet fully understood and appreciated. And let's not forget with the option of Alexis Tsipras to seek again democratic legitimacy through elections after the signature of the third memorandum. This was not the case of previous governments who signed memoranda and tried to avoid elections. So, after the signature of the third memorandum and the second elections won by Syriza in September 2015, the political landscape was rather different. There was a complete retreat of the social movement of the previous years, and the anti-memoranda rhetoric had exhausted its impact and its dynamic. So in terms of democracy, the second government of Syriza invested in institutional reforms and prioritized the liberal agenda, especially during the most difficult and time-consuming negotiations with the Troika between 2016 and 2017, but also later, after the signature of the Bratis agreement, Syriza conservative cleavage this time. Just to remind you some of these reforms, during its term, Syriza voted the new Greek nationality code, the abolition of ultra-conservative legislation of the previous period, new penal legislation, the civil union for homosexual couples, the bill on legal recognition of sex self-identification, the new proportional electoral law, the reform of local government, including proportional electoral law, reinforcement of local communities, local and regional referenda, consultation procedures, etc., new legislation on licensing of media, etc. At the same time, Syriza initiated the process of a constitutional reform. What was important about this is not only the content of the governmental proposal, the provision of new rights, the constitutional protection of the proportionality of electoral systems, etc. It was equally, if not more important, because of the new participatory process that Syriza tried to adopt for the preparation of this proposal. It formed a special committee presided by Michalis Bartsidis that organized special consultations, public events, etc., and even proposing a consultative referendum, a proposal that was later dropped because of the fierce opposition it met. So let me come to my final remarks. First of all, what was the impact of the presence of Syriza in the political forefront and of its initiatives once in government? Undoubtedly, Syriza, we can say that it healed the severely hurt Greek democracy, and it lifted most of the consequences that the previous period had. As we can see in the diagram, throughout the period during which Syriza was marching towards power, interest in politics kept rising. One can also note that the presence of a party such as Syriza in office and the legislation it adopted had also an educative, let's say, impact on the overall attitudes of the society, especially in matters of the so-called liberal agenda. When the law on the civil union for same-sex couples was voted, for example, popular support for same-sex marriages was at its highest levels, as we can see in the diagram. However, the positive impact of Syriza was limited. Akis already mentioned a few thoughts. As we saw, it did not go as far as totally overcoming the pre-existing crisis. First of all, the implementation of austerity policies inherently contradicted any attempt for transformative policies on the political and the democratic level. And of course, the decline of social availability and of support for Syriza did not permit more radical initiatives or limited the impact of any initiatives that the government did take. What we see in the diagram is characteristic. Dissatisfaction from the function of democracy was at its lowest level in the first trimester of Syriza government, but 3 years later, in 2018, it had reached again, luckily not the levels of 2012, but even so, those of 2010. The signature of the third memorandum fueled once more a sentiment of frustration. Also, the failure of Syriza to successfully politicize even the initiatives it did take and to create an alternative narrative and a social coalition on this agenda was apparent. Perhaps the most characteristic example is in the diagram. Syriza voted a proportional electoral system for national elections in 2016 and for local and regional elections in 2018. Whereas we can see in the diagram that the new right-wing government managed to abolish both Syriza laws in 2019 with no resistance at all. So there was no social bloc to protect these reforms. And of course, One should not forget the populist party that forced Syriza to depend on the opposition in order to pass any progressive and liberal legislation. And second, the successful strategy of the right-wing opposition to create an anti-Syriza bloc that was impossible to break regardless of the political agenda. So to come to my conclusion, 3 points, rather 3 points instead of a conclusion. First, the Greek case proves that it is impossible to have a democracy without a demos, as it is impossible to have an illiberal democracy. Once a democratic element goes down, the others will sooner or later follow when the circumstances reverse to a large extent the damages caused to all three elements of democracy in Greece during the first half of the last decade. However, it failed to take up more decisive transformative initiatives, especially because the signature of the third memorandum deprived it from the necessary social support and mobilization. And finally, a successful strategy for democracy from the part of the left has more prerequisites. First, a simultaneous intervention at the sociopolitical level to secure social availability, and at the institutional level with reforms that broaden participation and support the popular element. Second, a politicization of the process and a political actor, a party, willing to and capable of deploying such a strategy in order to go beyond the simple revival of traditional democracy, which is not only outdated, but is also impossible to maintain without radical reforms. And of course, a rupture with austerity policies is of absolute necessity. Thank you very much. Your mic is out.
Okay, thank you for the nice presentation. Our third speaker is going to be Ilias Georgatas, who is an associate professor at the University of Crete, and will present a paper or a speech co-authored with Christoforos Bernardakis, who unfortunately cannot be with us here in the presentation. Christoforos is an associate professor of Aristotle University of Thessalonica and a former Minister of Administrative Reconstruction. Currently, he is an MP of Syriza, elected in the 1st District of Athens. The topic of the presentation is negotiating the quartet, which is not a musical group, but a cluster of institutional power actors, Syriza's policy responses in public administration. Ilias, you have the forum.
Thank you, George. Warm greetings to the audience, and I would like to extend our thanks to the Institute for inviting us, especially so since this is dedicated to the memory of the great and unforgettable comrade, an intellectual and political comrade, Leo Panitch. Okay, I will try to be as specific as possible. Let's begin with the basic. What is the quartet? Who plays in the quartet? What kind of tunes? Who calls the tunes? The quartet is also known by the more high-sounding designation, the institutions. In effect, it is the ex-Troika plus one more member on board. They are those institutions sitting at the creditor side of the negotiating table, namely the IMF, the European Central Bank, the European Commission. This is the Troika of olden times, plus a fourth player holding the purse of the bailout money, that is the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM. The ESM was the successor to the FSF, the European Financial Stability Facility. It was the main vehicle financing the Greek bailout, together with loans from the IMF and the countries of the euro area. ESM and previously the EFSF provided to Greece loans amounting to 204 billion euros and now hold more than 50% of its total public debt. Those 204 billion of rescue money were dispersed during the 3 economic adjustment programs running from May 2010 till August 2018. Now, these 3 rescue programs are otherwise known as MOUs, namely Memoranda of Understanding. Of these three, the third economic adjustment program is the one signed by the Syriza government shortly after coming to power. It started in the late summer of 2015 and was successfully concluded after 3 years in the summer of 2018. It amounted to not more than 62 billion euros, or 24% of total European loans given to Greece over the 8.5 years of the Greek debt crisis. However, by far the largest and yet socially destructive program was the second adjustment program, running from 2012 to 2015, with a financial envelope of 142 billion euros, or 55% of the total European loans being given as bailout money from the FSF mechanism. It is worth mentioning, but also often forgotten, that of the three adjustment programs, only the third was successfully concluded, leading to an exit from institutional supervision in the summer of 2018, after 8.5 years of policy surveillance from the institutions. The first two programs, or MOUs, that were signed before Syriza came to power, which amounted to no less than 76% of European bailout money, were never ever concluded. Now, the quartet did everything they could to keep as many items on the agenda as possible. Moreover, any agenda item ought to be translated to tangible deliverables. Often the quartet did not limit itself to demanding the agreed deliverables. It also insisted on being notified prior to any legislative initiative being taken by the government. Thus, the so-called right of initiative, namely the most essential feature of sovereignty, was substantially delimited. When the quartet asked for prior notification, it often reminded negotiation teams of a clause contained in the conclusions of the Euro Summit statement made on the 12th of July 2015. Quote, "The government needs to consult and agree with the institutions on all draft legislation in relevant areas with adequate time before submitting it for public consultation or to Parliament." End of quote. I'm going now to the second part of our talk. Let's sum up the main implications of this burdensome regime for public policy making. 6 points to be made here. Point 1. Governing under probation, public policy enters a state of captivity. The institutions impose a regime of very strict policy surveillance. Point number 2, limited fiscal sovereignty. Fiscal autonomy is limited way beyond the limits imposed by normal European standards. Point 3, primary policy capture. Policy making is captured by external agents. Creditor rights are factored in, and the total policy equation cannot be resolved before reaching a so-called common understanding of the issues involved. Number 4, secondary policy capture. A variety of domestic agents with powerful vested interests acquire voice in the policy-making process. This happens in an extra-parliamentarian, if not counter-parliamentarian manner, based on the eclectic policy preferences of the institutions. Certain so-called stakeholders are elevated by several notches in the consultation process and become powerful interlocutors. These domestic agents acquire the ability to bypass representative government and establish direct communication channels with institutions. Number 5, policy constraints. Fiscal capacity is impoverished, yet policy goals do not address the causes of its poverty. They simply seek to optimize the output of its poverty. Point number 6, enormous opportunity cost for the government. Everyday governmental work in all its aspects, daily schedules, administrative effort, human and material resources, organizational mental load, legislative creativity, is diverted to memoranda management, deliverables, and assessment deadlines. Negotiational overload impacts on objective setting and aggravates organizational fatigue. Now let's turn to the third part, which is the kind of responses that the Syriza government formulated towards the quartet in order to improve policy output and address this hostile milieu. 9 points to be made here. Point number 1, behavioral simulation. Here we're talking about a swift adaptation of the negotiating teams to the modalities of the quartet. It was key to develop a quick understanding of the modalities dictated by the negotiating table. Syriza successfully managed to deconstruct and transcend the weak position of the debtor and try to negotiate as if this was not a behavioral determinant. Make it clear to the institutions that an exploitation of the weak debtor position on the part of the quartet will not lead to viable and lasting settlement. Point number 2, Europeanization of the issues involved. By this we mean that the negotiating teams tried to avoid at all costs an internalization of the issues involved, and by all means keep clear of the trap of Greek exceptionalism, while at the same time trying to project the stakes as a common European problem deserving a sympathetic approach. Point number 3, achieve equal or peer status. It was important to overcome the weak negotiating position and make it understood that a productive dialogue requires an earnest approach. It was established that discussions would take place among peers and at peer level. Then peers can discuss in more equal terms. Point number 4, trust and credibility building. It was important to improve the trust bond that was very badly damaged during the previous 2 memoranda between 2010 and 2015. The negotiating strategy established clear rules of engagement between the 2 parties, the government and the institutions, with evidence-based methodologies and clear argumentation. Each stage of the negotiations was tied to tangible results, thus creating trust and credibility for the government. Disagreements were openly discussed and clearly defined and understood by both sides. Common ground took precedence over disagreements that could be elevated at the top political level. Point number 5, understanding the bureaucracy. It was key to have in mind that, as with all bureaucracies, the EU bureaucracy, I would say especially the EU bureaucracy, needs to deliver results and show progress to their political hierarchy. The Greek side of the table could provide the necessary input for such tangible results and make the ball rolling. On this basis, it was key to develop a modus operandi that maximizes mutual benefit of both sides of the table. Point number 6, proactive agenda setting. It was crucial to not let the quartet set the agenda alone. It was one thing to raise an issue and quite another thing to formulate its parameters. The Greek side did both things. Wherever it could, it would intervene in the agenda setting process and proactively define its final contents. In those cases where it was impossible to deflect a thorny item from entering the agenda, the Greek side would proactively engage the quartet in formulating the parameters of the issue in a manner that was more conducive to the government's views. Point number 7, dual-track policy making. Given the acute policy constraints, it was of paramount importance to keep a dual-track approach in policy making. Apart from the track that was colonized by the quartet, the government managed to develop a parallel track of policy initiatives that fell outside the domain of the quartet's mandate. Also, there were those cases where the government had created room for a proactive agenda setting. In these occasions, complementary policy measures were put in place that could either counterbalance undesired effects or establish an entirely new field of policy intervention. Point number 8, never negotiate with. A key policy response was that the government, deliberately or not, chose not to negotiate with the quartet, but to negotiate the quartet as a hurdle. Point number 9, the get out and get out soon objective. There was a shared understanding in government negotiating teams that certain domestic vested interests had no reason whatsoever to desire an exit from the MOUs. An externally imposed disciplinarian regime especially of the IMF creed, suited them just fine, and the longer it lasted, the better for their austerity dreams. Had it been in their powers, their best option would be to never get out of the MOUs. Syriza policy ran totally counter to this. The only way to get rid of an MOU is to get out of it as fast as you can. That's what Syriza did, and with just a quarter of the total bailout money given to Greece, it managed not only to get the country out of trouble, but also to bail out the other 3/4 of the money that was wasted between 2010 and 2015. Tomorrow, Jean-Luc Nancy will talk about the two kinds of negativity. He will argue that, and I quote, there is the negativity we go through, the one we traverse, and there is the negativity where we stop. It seems at first sight obvious that the first is the good negativity, the one we get through, and the second is the bad one. The first one would be the dialectical, Hegelian negativity, and the second seems to be devoid of all resources. In retrospect, I think that the whole series experiment firmly belongs to the first kind. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, Elias, for this penetrative, incisive presentation of the negotiating strategies and classes, if you like. I would like to cherry pick a few points and wave them in a common canvas and address it to you and respond, all of you, to whatever point you would like to address. I think Elias pinpointed something very important, that in relationships between creditors and debtors, there is always asymmetry of power. And the same thing is, generally speaking, in any kind of class struggle, in opposition between classes. There is always asymmetry of power that has to be taken into consideration. On the basis of that, perhaps the left should take into consideration Gramsci's idea of war of maneuvering, of working within objective constraints in order to try to impose or implement one or another structural reform or policy. We don't operate, the left cannot operate in a vacuum. Okay, from Danai, I really got the very nice idea, which is important, that as Poulantzas said, there is this modern trend towards authoritarian statism. Nevertheless, Syriza trying to open up the democratic spaces, try to incorporate the voice of the people in various dimensions throughout the political sphere, the public sphere, which is very important, because it shows that the left must try to motivate and empower people to participate and have their voices heard. I would like to make a personal comment in that, because so much discussion is spent on the issue of ideological hegemony. We cannot put outside the picture the tremendous power held by the mass media system, because ideological hegemony, this is the fundamental state apparatus, to follow Poulantzas, that really controls, colonizes the general mind and the consciousness of society. So you cannot put it outside, do not consider it. And Syriza, even during government, had the whole systematic media system against it. So this has to be taken into account. And now, a few comments concerning the presentation of Peters. It is very important to understand the historical background. The crisis of 2009-2010 is fundamentally a public debt crisis for Greece. This is the outcome of co-optation of social strata of Greek society through social transferences, through subsidies, through clientelistic relations that have been mentioned. That's why you had this kind of explosion of public debt. Apart from chronic capitalism and large oligopolistic interests that reproduces an accumulated capital through extraction from state resources. So the crisis meant that we had a kind of, first of all, demoralization of the political elites. Second, this kind of system of the state could not be reproduced anymore. This caused the alignment, political de-alignment, and liquidification, if you like, of the ties, the political ties of the electorate with the established powers that control the system, the political system. And this created a political vacuum within which Syriza could get into and build relations of political representation. So this has to be taken into consideration because it is a fundamental idea of Poulantzas, for example, in the analysis of fascism, that the political elites have to undergo a crisis situation in order for this kind of swift political changes to happen in any kind of established state system. So I would like to address this point if you like to comment or take up and build some further thoughts on this.
We only have 4 minutes, so just a short comment.
1 or 2 minutes each, let's say. Do Ilya want to start?
Let me just say, I disagree with the premise that the crisis of 2009-10 was an outcome of social spending or clientelism or anything else, you know, largely in particular to Greek politics. This is the conservative argument that there is a Greek exceptionalism. It's especially incompetent or enabled to control its spending and so forth. Public spending in Greece up until then was not very much above average, of course, compared to the rest of the European Union. Public debt was pretty consistent from the early 90s onwards. Roughly 100% of GDP will go down to 92, 93, up to 105, down, up. You know, and the fact that you had the crisis in all of the periphery of Europe concurrently, it wasn't just Greece that had a debt crisis. It was also Ireland and Portugal and Spain and so forth, points to the fact that it was something well beyond Greece that was the root cause of the crisis. Of course, the way it's articulated in Greece is historically particular. That's true. But I think is a mistake to say it was the causes of the crisis in Greece were Greek. You know, it was much more, I think, universal. And that's why the Greek case was so significant. And everyone pays so much attention to Greece because it was, in effect, it had relevance also to their society. You know, what happened in Greece was also relevant to what was happening there, and the potential solutions or fail of the solutions spoke also to their internal situation.
Yes?
Yeah, just a brief comment on that. I think that, as I tried to argue, once you get into trouble, you better get out of it as soon as you can. I think this is regardless of what we say of what happened, what factors are responsible for this very dire situation. The fact remains that we lost 5 years, 2 MOUs, and about 170 billion euros without doing anything. The depth of the crisis in 2015, I think it has a lot to do with that. That there was not a swift reaction to make things straight again, regardless of what happened in the outside parameters or the inside, the internal parameters of the Greek economy. There was a hell of a lot of time, 5 years, without being able to formulate an effectual response towards things that perhaps were outside our ability to influence, because we had global financial markets coming down. We had the attack on the Greek bonds and their credibility and so on. 5 years of ineffectual policy that brought us to the brink of a catastrophe. That is juxtaposed in a completely different manner with the 3 years of the Syriza government. I am not someone who is, of course, in favor of the memoranda. It was just a terrible situation, but at least during these 3 years, we tried as a country to liberate ourselves from what happened after 2009. And that remains a fact, and I think that it is a legacy, with all the problems accompanying it, but it is a legacy that the Greek people and the Greek society is I think, ready to evaluate in a positive manner.
It is a form of foundation, somehow. Nanai?
Just one thought, Yorgos. I think the important about the strategy of Syriza, you mentioned opening democratic spaces. The important and the major problem was that Syriza tried to open those democratic spaces for all the reasons Ilias also helped us understand about the situation. But at the time it did so, the Greek people was not following. And so we opened democratic spaces, but there was no people to enter them. So next time we'd better do that in a more political and ideological way, and building social coalitions around those initiatives. This is just a short remark, because we have to wrap up, I think.
Yes, okay, let me close. Perhaps we have to take into consideration in left thinking a contradiction between political radicalism on the one hand and cultural conservatism on the other. Often, if we don't have ideological hegemony of leftist ideas, the populace is rather conservatively inclined in terms of what its dominant values and beliefs are. So this social cultural level has to be strictly seriously addressed by the left in order to fight to gain hegemony. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot for the nice presentations. Thanks also for the audience, the auditors who stayed with us and hopefully enjoyed our discussion and presentations. So let's have a good future, liberated from the pandemic, and bring the future of the left nearer to us. Thank you.
Dear friends, dear comrades, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for being here with us in the second conference of the research program Left Theory for the 21st Century, organized by Nicos Poulantzas Institute and funded by Transform Europe. My name is Aris Stylianou, and I am teaching philosophy at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and I will coordinate this session number 4 of this afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Costas Douzinas and Michalis Bartsidis for the whole organization. And as our conference is dedicated to the memory of Leo Panitch, let me say a few words on Leo. I met him for the last time in July 2019 in Thessaloniki, just after the elections in Greece that the right party of the New Democracy won. And we had lunch with Leo and Melanie, and we had a very interesting discussion about Marxism and Syriza and socialism and of course the elections in Greece. I am really very sad for his death, and we will always remember Leo, and we will always be inspired by his important work. And now let me introduce you in this session concerning left theory and inequalities. Inequalities, I think it is the most difficult issue in nowadays politics and social struggles, and for the left, of course, because equality, both with liberty, is the most important value for the left and for the radical movements. The question is if it is possible to face and to reduce inequalities in our societies in these times of neoliberalism's hegemony in this globalization era. Because if institutional reforms or cultural politics or social reforms are possible to reach, there is in economics and in finance economy, there is a lot of difficulties, problems to manage, and economics always, I think, is a critical point in the left politics, in the left strategy about social reform. For all these issues, we have three I am sure, very interesting presentations today. First of all, Efi Achtsioglu, after that, Maria Karamersini, and last but not least, Giorgos Stamboulis. Efi Achtsioglu will talk to us about Syriza and the social issue. Efi Achtsioglu is a member of the Hellenic Parliament with the Syriza party, and she is former Minister of Labour, Social Security and Social Solidarity. Efi Achtsioglu is a lawyer, and she holds a PhD in law and in public law and political science. And Effie, you can start your presentation now.
Thank you, Aris. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Poulantzas Institute for this conference and the opportunity that gives to us to have a good discussion on such difficult times. Just one correction, my PhD is in labor law. That's why I'm gonna focus in my presentation on the social issue, which in my view concerns mainly labor relations. Dear friends, the COVID pandemic has come to define the terms of every discourse, from the economy and social matters to inequalities, the role of the state, fundamental rights. However, I'm going to argue that in Greece, the pandemic did not precipitate any change in dominant neoliberal politics. Quite the opposite, the implementation continues uninterrupted. A brief review of the recent history of labor relations will allow us to confirm this continuity and will also allow us to revisit the role played by the Syriza government between 2015 and 2019 as regards precisely this neoliberal continuity. Let's take a step back. Since the mid-90s, but especially mainly since 2000, Europe is being exposed to intense deregulation of the labor market. The pace and intensity of such deregulation may be quicker or slower in each country, depending on the country. It does, however, affect the whole of Europe. In practice, this deregulation plays out in a twofold way. On the one hand, labor rights and protections laid down during the previous years are withdrawn. This process entails the reversion of the protective framework that has been gradually set up during previous decades. On the other hand, new forms of flexible work, of flexible labor, including bogus self-employment, push certain groups of workers outside the protective framework of organized labor. In fact, large categories of working people slip through the cracks of labor legislation, while the political forces responsible for their exclusion note their consent. Interestingly, this wave of deregulation was primarily driven by social democratic forces in Europe. In some cases, social unrest succeeded in holding back the regulation processes. However, even in those cases where social resistance decelerated the regulation, it did not manage to stop it. The intention has been a downward redefinition of the working class's needs as they have historically developed. Greece has been following a similar path since 2000. However, the period between 2010 and 2014 has been a watershed in the history of deregulation of the labor market. This is so because the deregulation was at the very heart of the first two MOUs, Memoranda of Understanding, programs of fiscal adjustment that were implemented in the country. The blueprint is more or less familiar. Low levels of competitiveness of the Greek economy was thought that would be tackled through internal devaluation, namely through wage reductions and removal of general labor protections. Much like wage reductions, the taking away of protections was itself directed at the reduction of payroll costs. In other words, the argument went that if the state implemented wage cuts and removed labor rights, the trade deficit would be reduced, the country would attract more investors, and so forth. The results of these policies are widely known. Between 2010 and 2014, unemployment rates skyrocketed to 28%, to 60% for the youth. We witnessed the creation of a new generation of what was called working poor. The risk of poverty and material deprivation increased not just for the unemployed, but also for the working population. An unprecedented humanitarian crisis hit the country, while at the same time the economy, far from improving, was pushed to even deeper recession. Between 2015 and 2019, the Syriza government tried to do the following. It sought to reverse these deregulatory tendencies that were unfolding since the 1990s. The room for maneuver to implement such a strategy to reverse these deregulatory tendencies was suffocatingly little. This was notably because Syriza was called upon to run the country under a draconian conditionality framework, under a third MOU. It was exceptionally difficult to promote reforms that ran counter to the rationales of the first two MOUs. Such a strategy to proceed with backtracking of the reforms would provoke the Troika. The room for maneuver was also limited for another reason. There was and there is no workers' movement in Greece able to shift power balances in a direction that would allow a re-regulation of the labor market. At this stage, it needs to be noted that the political influence of Syriza was larger, significantly larger, than the party's social grounding in collective organizations of workers. There was a huge distance between the political influence of a party and its social roots. Any such involvement has been weak. I'm talking about the involvement of the collective organization of workers. For those not familiar with Greek reality, since 2000s, the power of trade unions has significantly diminished, while they have failed to exert any substantial influence in workplaces. Union density in Greece is extremely low, among the lowest in Europe, and at the moment, trade unions represent a tiny minority of the country's workers. So the room for maneuver for Syriza government to implement the strategy of reversing the deregulation was extremely little. Things were equally disheartening with respect to the European left, and I want to be sincere about that. I would go as far as arguing that instead of leading a collective pan-European struggle against the establishment, the European left actually expected Syriza to wage war on the European status quo all by itself. Even within this hostile environment, the government of Syriza managed to reverse the deregulatory tendencies to a significant extent. Hesitantly, at the first stages of MOU supervision, but much more confidently after the exit of the memoranda. Syriza pursued a path directly opposite to the deregulation that was prevalent during previous years. On the one hand, it re-established the rights and protective framework previously removed. On the other, it sought to regulate aspects of labor that had never been there, that had never been regulated in the past. For example, it brought within the protective scope of the law some of the widespread forms of flexible and precarious labor. Within this context, the government of Syriza restored collective bargaining processes, increased the minimum wage, abolished the sub-minimum wage for the youth. It laid down a framework for combating undeclared work, for protecting bogus self-employed, and for regulating dismissals and working time. All in all, what Syriza sought to do, what Syriza's strategy sought to do, was to terminate a long process of squeezing the scope of historically developed working class needs. And I believe that to a great extent, the government of Syriza succeeded to this end. Now, when in the summer of 2019, the government of New Democracy of the right-wing party was elected and came to office, it became immediately evident that they were intending to resume the deregulation process exactly where they left off, at the end of 2014. The first move, actually to erase the Syriza period in this matter. The first move was made within a couple of months from election. New Democracy removed the regulatory framework previously established by Syriza almost in its entirety. One of the first actions of the government carried out already in the summer of 2019 was the abolition of protection against dismissals, the cancellation of protections for the bogus self-employed, the downgrading of the battle against undeclared work. This was soon followed by a suspension of collective bargaining and of minimum wage regulation. This process of regression was completed within less than 4 months. And truth be told, its completion did not meet with substantial social resistance. Once again, it became clear that Syriza's labor agenda has been, let's say, more progressive than the social average. It is precisely, in my view, this unfavorable balance of social powers that allowed New Democracy to abolish the previous protective framework free from social resistance. The COVID-19 pandemic was used by the neoliberal government as an opportunity to speed up deregulation, when one would expect that it would at least halt deregulatory tendencies or at least trigger a so-called Keynesian response. What is particularly interesting is that New Democracy did not even leave this deregulation to the market. It did not leave the regulatory tendencies of the market to unfold by themselves, despite the fact that in times of crisis, markets generally tend to deregulate without the need of a policy boost. Instead, the government chose to intervene with legislative initiatives in order to legally stamp this deregulation, to make sure that it would happen. As such, the neoliberal government also abolished Syriza's working time protections, effectively scrapping whatever remained of Syriza's regulatory initiatives. At the same time, New Democracy availed itself of the crisis in order to introduce new forms of flexible labor, which now seem to be acquiring a permanent status. These include new systems of suspension from work, new forms of job rotation, in tandem with wage reductions and reductions in Christmas and Easter bonuses. And at the same time, new deregulatory initiatives have already been announced to come shortly regarding individual labor standards and collective rights. As a result of the above, in 2020, Greece ranked third in wage reductions in Europe. According to Eurostat, low-paid workers suffered the second largest wage reduction in Europe, and Greece was first among European states in reduction in working hours in 2020. At the same time, the government of New Democracy chose not to support the income floor and middle class, despite the absence of budgetary constraints, and its strategy for small and medium enterprises has led those businesses to financial asphyxiation and the struggle for survival. The result of all this is that at the end of 2020, Greece suffered the deepest recession in Europe, despite the fact that the country entered the pandemic crisis relatively late and experienced an exceptionally trouble-free first wave. Now, these policies are obviously no casual mistakes or random or unfortunate choices. They are part of a comprehensive and consistent strategic plan. Besides, the government's neoliberal strategy becomes crystal clear in the Bartsidis report, the document in which the government sets out its future growth strategy. That strategy in this report is reflected in 4 key points. First, further flexibilization of labor with a direct impact on wages. Second, privatization of services, of healthcare services, of education, of social security services, of infrastructure. Thirdly, reduction to a point of elimination of small and medium enterprises, which are generally considered as a burden. Fourthly, reductions in social spending in order to proceed to tax reductions for the wealthy. This approach, this growth strategy of the neoliberal agenda repeats actually the rationale of the reforms implemented in Greece already in the period before 2010 and 2014, or more forcefully applied between 2010 and 2014. So neoliberal continuity has therefore been prescribing its own evolution. The question must be whether there is a way out from this. We must reflect on whether a fundamental break is likely in this dominant economic paradigm, as well as with respect to the social issue. My view is not as pessimistic as one would think. First, because neoliberal deregulation may have continued uninterrupted during the pandemic, yet the pandemic itself made the limits of a neoliberalism manifest. The COVID crisis has been a blow to the internal consistency of neoliberal arrangements and mainly to social consent to such arrangements. The pandemic exposed the limits of a governing formula that devaluated all things public and idolized private initiative. It shows that the spontaneous market order cannot guarantee optimum results. It further demonstrated the significance of state intervention in the economy and of labor protection. And I'm convinced that partly to the challenges, the ongoing challenges that the Greek people are confronted with, the need for a fundamental change of strategy is solidifying in collective consciousness. The pandemic has made people appreciate the value of public services, of the public healthcare system, of its personnel. People have further realized the downside of devaluation of not just the healthcare system, but also of public transports, of the welfare state. This reshuffling of social attitudes could lead to an urgently needed political shift towards a radical left direction. And I'm optimistic for another reason, and that is that there seems to be a rearrangement in Europe. I have no illusions. I'm by no means claiming that the EU is drastically distancing itself from neoliberal orthodoxy. It is, however, undeniable that the Union's response to this crisis, to the pandemic crisis, was fundamentally different to that of the previous decade's financial crisis. Back then, we all remember that the EU was, its response was a persistent demand for austerity. During the pandemic crisis, though, it focused on expansionary policies. It suspended its extremely harsh discipline budgetary rules. It financed the largest ever stimulus package and partially neutralized debt. No doubt, much of this has happened before because of the fear of collapse of the Italian and Spanish economies, but the importance of this measure will not be unnoticed. Of equal importance is an evident disruption in the previously unchallenged European neoliberal bloc. Now, do these transformations signify the end of austerity or even the end of neoliberalism? Of course not, but the cracks are here. And there is a window of opportunity that the left must take advantage of. In other words, a whole field of possibilities is opening now before us. First, because the public is more open and responsive to a left agenda. And second, because what seemed like an impenetrable neoliberal orthodoxy is bit by bit cracking open. So the question we have before us is whether the left will stand up to the new developments and whether it will capitalize on the momentum to achieve a left-wing turn. Let us not forget that periods of normality never create opportunities for the left. Opportunities always revealed when the system reached its limits. And we are now in front of precisely such an opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Achtsioglu, for this very interesting presentation and for the optimistic conclusion. Thank you very much. Now we will pass to the presentation of Maria Karamessini, The title is Mass Unemployment, Employment Policy and Welfare State Reform under Syriza Government. And Maria Karamiassini is a professor of labor economics and economics of the welfare state at Pantheon University in Athens, and she is ex-president and governor of the Greek Public Employment Agency. Maria, go on.
Dear friends and comrades, as a way of introduction, I will start with some established facts that should always be reminded before analyzing the experience of Syriza government. First point, Syriza took the government under extraordinary conditions of a paramount economic and social crisis, a huge and structural fiscal crisis of the state, and a deep political crisis consisting of a crisis of legitimacy of the dominant power bloc. Second point, the main indicators of this work-like economic and social crisis were mass unemployment and mass poverty of unprecedented scale in the economic history of capitalist crisis worldwide. Third point, since September 2015, Syriza's government's room of maneuver in policy making was seriously restricted, being obliged to prolong austerity policy under the third economic adjustment program it had signed, and accept the strict surveillance, the custody of the EU and the IMF. Now, in order to establish the successes of Syriza government, I will provide some facts. The successes in combating mass unemployment and poverty. Between the end of 2014 and mid-2019, there has been a drastic reduction of the unemployment rate from 26% to 17% of the labor force. There has also been a drastic reduction of poverty and social exclusion rate from 36% to 30% of the population. And as a result of the above, income inequalities have been drastically reduced as well. I will proceed to some supplementary remarks. First of all, Syriza government has also inherited a residual and fragmented social protection system against unemployment and poverty, an understaffed state apparatus also lacking the capacity for planning and implementing institutional reforms and policy innovations, and structural neoliberal reforms agreed with the Troika by previous governments and passed on as conditionalities in the third MOU. Success in combating mass unemployment and poverty would have been impossible without implementing both alternative policies and non-neoliberal directions in welfare state reform. This is part of the parallel program of Syriza. The aim of my talk is to explain the successes of Syriza government in combating mass unemployment and poverty, to discuss the efforts made, but also the obstacles met by Syriza government to also lay the foundations for a new model of welfare state, and to critically reflect on the governmental experience of Syriza government experience from a left theory of the welfare state and social transformation perspective. First of all, I will discuss the determinants of success in combating mass unemployment. This success is due to the sizable growth of jobs between 2014 and 2019. The main determinants of sustained job growth were three. The first one was the good performance of tourism, which accounts for 22% of net job growth. The second determinant was the new employment policy mix, where there has been an important role of recurrent public work schemes or other special employment schemes in the public sector, making a net contribution to job growth. It has been estimated that about 28% of net job growth over the whole period of Syriza government is due to this kind of policies. And the third determinant of the good job growth performance is the relaxation of austerity in 2018 and expansionary macroeconomic policy in the first semester of 2019. Now, in the area of employment policy, the most important reform was the reform of the Greek Public Employment Agency. It was planned in 2012 under the supervision of the Troika and involved the outsourcing of counseling and matching services to the private sector. Syriza government reversed the direction. It has instead invested in the enhancement of the agency's own capacity to provide quality counseling and matching services, and experimented with innovative employment promotion schemes. A very important aspect of the reform under Syriza government has been the permanent mobilization of all the agency's employees. I underline the word all agency's employees, to ensure their active engagements to the vision and aims of the project. The positive reaction and adherence to the reform has been a great asset for change and a good example for a left strategy of public sector reform. Unfortunately, Syriza government has been unable to reform the residual income protection system against unemployment, although OAED did not lack resources, given the requirement of the third MOU for primary general government surpluses. I will now come to social policy under Syriza government. During the first phase, which is grosso modo between 2015 and 2017, the explicit aim of social policy, the focus, the real focus, was anti-poverty priority. It was the anti-poverty priority. Since we were living in a humanitarian crisis and a very large part of the population had no access to food, energy, accommodation, or healthcare. And the national health system was at the brink of collapse. So, unsurprisingly, the first law of Syriza government in 2015 was on the humanitarian crisis, providing food, free electricity, and accommodation to those in extreme poverty. This law was replaced in 2017 by the law establishing the social solidarity income. At the same time, free access to the national health system was provided by Syriza government to 1/3 of the population that was deprived from health insurance. At the same time, the financial support was provided to the national health system alongside with new hires on a temporary basis. Last but not least was the free access to formal childcare services of low and medium income families through a special program put in place. Coming to the second phase of social policy reforms under Syriza government, which starts towards the end of 2017 or the beginning of 2018, the social policy focus is on the construction of a new welfare state model, or more concretely, the focus was on laying the foundations for the construction and the creation of a new welfare state model. This included several initiatives. First of all, the rationalization of the fragmented system of welfare benefits, the digitalization of their delivery, which was key for the abolishment of clientelism, and the creation of new supportive services in the form of municipal community centers. A second initiative, big initiative, was the establishment of the main institutions for the creation of a public primary healthcare system for the first time in Greece's history. The fourth initiative, important initiative, was the extension of compulsory preschool education from 1 to 2 years. And last but not least, the extension to all primary school pupils of the free school meals program, which was launched in 2017. Now I'll come to and close my presentation with some reflections on the experience of Syriza government. First, a reflection. In spite of constant interference and surveillance by the Troika, the extremely limited fiscal space, and resistances at the high ranks of Greek public administration, Syriza government has maintained its representation of the interest of dominated classes and social groups, and has been able to protect and advance these interests through the implementation of its parallel program, itself in constant negotiations with the Troika. In the fields of employment and welfare policy, as in other policy areas, Syriza government has managed to exclude or bypass the neoliberal elements of institutional reform prescribed in the third MOU and integrated the modernization elements in a left perspective of welfare state reform, which has though remained incomplete. Third reflection. The outcomes of negotiations with the Troika over the parallel program would have been different if there was social mobilization taking place. This is a very well-known theme in Marxist theory of the state and social transformation. That is, the relationship between the struggle within and outside institutions, within and outside the state when the left is in power. I refer to, for those who are interested, to the last interviews by Nicos Poulantzas before and after the coalition government of socialists and communists was formed in France in the beginning of the 80s. Due to traditional clientelism in hirings and the politicization of the Greek public administration, there has been an hostility against Syriza government, especially by the high ranks of government officials. However, to my view, the main obstacles in the welfare state reform and in general in state reform are of structural nature. The Greek state is understaffed and public servants are untrained for years. There is a lack of tools and capacity for planning and implementing institutional reforms and policy innovations among the executives of public administration. There is a hierarchical management leaving no space to initiative from below. And there is a lack of democratic institutions of participation, but also disciplinary tools and processes which prevent a good management of the public sector. So the left strategy for reforming the state should take into account mostly the structural features of the Greek state in order to prepare a left strategy for a second time of Syriza government, if this happens and occurs in the coming years. Syriza government has been unable to transform the state, lacking the time and the concrete plan alternative to that of the Troika. Consequently, it has failed to mobilize the basis of public servants to a vision of a public service reform. Drawing from Syriza experience, a contemporary left theory of the welfare state would need to reflect more on the role of the EU in shaping national policy and in overdetermining class and social struggles at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karamessini, for this excellent presentation of the social policy during Syriza government and the policies about employment and poverty, anti-poverty plan, etc. Now is the turn of Georgios Stamboulis, who is a professor at the Department of Economics in the University of Thessaly. And Georgios Stamboulis will, his title of his presentation is Technological Revolutions, Development, Work and Social Rights. Professor Stamboulis.
Yes, good evening, and thank you, Aris. And it's a privilege to present in the Poulantzas conference. I thank you, the organizers, and it was a privilege to follow after the two distinguished ladies that set the floor for a very interesting discussion. I think I will need a little of your help to share the presentation, my presentation, because I'm still looking at Maria's one, and I can't find my own. Anyway, I will start talking. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption. I will start from where Effie also started, that is from the premise that the social conditions and the social state are in interplay with the relations of production. And I think what I'm going to do is draw on our past experience and my own interests to make an argument for the next hopeful left government somewhere in Europe. It was some time ago that in the 1990s that two of the most well-known scholars of social welfare state in Greece argued in the first instance, it was in the Sakis Karagiorgas conference in 1993, if I remember well, that the crisis of the pension system and the insurance system as a whole, which in Greece includes also health coverage and so on, is inextricably linked to the crisis of the Fordism. And since then, however, we didn't discuss that much anymore. We stayed within, I would say, the agenda set by neoliberalism and to a large degree to seeking a parametric solution to the crisis. What has been happening since the early 70s is that the crisis of the pension system has been built as an argument for capitalization, neoliberal capitalization of the pension system, based on one hand the fiscal crisis and on the other hand the need for profit and competitiveness on the private sector, arguing the quite well-trodden argument that labor costs are the cause for the lack of competitiveness, which anybody who is well-versed in strategy and competition knows that it's quite inaccurate, and we can see that in any competitiveness report. But the issue is that through this period, we have seen also the rise of the pension system as an important player of the international institutional investment system. And it has been an element of the financialization of capitalism as well. We have experiences of that in Greece as well, where major foreign pension funds have been part of the Greek privatization program. And this creates a new form of quasi-imperialism in ways that we have not explored quite. In any case, what the neoliberal approach to pensions is that it's a private issue, it's an individual issue. And in that sense, as Hyde and Dixon mentioned about 10 years ago, they failed to acknowledge that there is an element of justice that has to be sought through the pension system. Neoliberalism is hostile to equality. So in these discussions that we're having today, it's quite foreign to, as we well know, to the narrative of neoliberalism. But if that is so, then neoliberalism cannot actually cover the social needs. And Hyde and Dixon also went on to say that following the Rawlsian framework, we need to have a pension system that follows some core principles of distributive justice. So they're saying that we need three pillars of a pension system. One is a pillar that will cover the basic needs of citizens, and in that sense, that would be a universal pension system. Then we need an element that would be rewarding commitments, and would be an element that would add in order to cover the difference between the universal pension and the level of previous income to some element. And the third is an equality element combined with a sense of freedom to operate, to use the resources in the system. In a sense, they argue for a system of two pillars. One is a state universal tax-funded pension system, and the other is a pension system that would also be obligatory pension pillar. That would be what we in Greece call the assistive pension, and would be based on income of various sources. If we follow this thinking, we need to go back and say, okay, but what is different from the existing pension system? Well, the system that we have now is a pay-as-you-go system. It's a system that under the neoliberal perspective is an issue of individual rights and not of a collective social right. It's a right that is not an element for the non-wage labor. So, for instance, in Greece, 1 in 6 old age people in pension age don't receive any kind of pension. It's a tax on wages, but not a tax on capital earnings and wealth that are created through labor. And in this sense, there's also a biased and fragile intergenerational contract, because what we have is a pension entitlement that is built irrespective of the conditions of the economy that are bestowed to the next generation. So intergenerational solidarity goes only one way. It doesn't go that have to the next generation a state of the economy that is better than with the one we received. And until now, that was something we did not take into account because we had not, since the 1930s, experienced such a level of crisis. And in the 1930s, there was not an element of social state, of welfare state and pension system as strong as there is now in Europe, and especially in countries like Greece. And then there is another element, a moral element, which is that we are raised in the sense that we work hard now and we will enjoy life when we're old. And this is an element that the new generations, as far as I can tell, don't buy in. It's not something that is something that a young person will say, this sounds reasonable to me. It might sound reasonable to all their generations, but I think our generation is in the middle between those two ages of thinking. And the final element of this system, which brings me back also to the discussion raised by Effie and Maria, is that there is a tacit assumption that in order for the system to operate, there needs to be full employment. So I will share with you one of the diagrams we have tried to develop, showing that for the system to be balanced, the payments to the pensioners should come from the people employed. I'm sorry, this is not it's not apparent here, and their contributions. So if fewer people are employed, or people do not enjoy full employment, are partially employed, precariously employed, and so on, then the system will fall out of balance. This will create a fiscal problem, and the solution would then be to resolve the crisis by one hand reducing pension levels, and on the other hand reducing contributions in seeking to enhance employment, which is actually an argument that we've heard a lot, but it's not very practical, as you can see. So the basic premise of a parametric solution to the system, and what Chletsos and Robolis actually argued in the 90s, in my opinion, is that this system is viable as long as Fordism would go on. And here is the diagram where the two top lines are the lines showing the amount of work in terms of working hours, not in percentages of employment, but in the amount of work built into Western Europe, which in this period more than increased its population by more than 30%, and North America, that's almost or more than doubled its population at the same period. And here you can see on the lower two lines the increase of GDP in these two areas in the same period in constant US dollar prices. So we can see that the low unemployment paradox that people in the mainstream are discussing with the Phillips curve and so on is evident, and it's also affecting the pension system, the fiscal stability, and in a sense the premise of the whole pay-as-you-go system. On the other hand, it's also increasing the whole inequality spectrum in terms of income, on social capital, on cultural capital, and we have not even reached the premise of the second period of the information revolution, which we expect to accelerate this process of job loss and jobless growth. And we can see evidence of this jobless growth showing up in the previous years in the rise of intacit assets, asset formation, intangible asset formation, where we can see that they are forming the core of this post-industrial, you would say, knowledge-based economy, where we will have increasing returns, and the seconds of growth will be coming on. So the solution would be, as Hayden Dixon and others have suggested, to move from a benefits, a labor-funded system to a tax-funded system, which would be a universal system. And this universal system would be based in other principles. And we can see that there are a few countries, I'm sorry you can't see it very well here, but there are a few countries like New Zealand, Ireland in Europe, and so on, that have had this system for a lot of years. And they enjoy, especially New Zealand, then less than 5% fiscal cost, 5% of GDP. They enjoy very low percentages of poverty in the over 65, and of course full coverage. The coverage in pension coverage in New Zealand, if I remember well, is above 96-98%. So it's a more equitable system that is also more ecological in terms of intergenerational solidarity, and it's also more viable. It's also less costly in many ways. My argument is that we could go from the current system to the new system in this area, in this period, if we combined this transition with a work time reduction. The first element of my presentation showed that it's impossible to go to full employment, however rapid growth we have, if we don't experience a new age of work time reduction, full work time reduction, as we did in the 1930s and 40s, and as it also happened in the turn of the previous century. Only under that condition can we have both full employment, have a basis for changing the balance of negotiative balance between capital and labor in the production process, and also have the conditions to fully fund the pension system and have more scope for social welfare state. I would like here to make a comment that Syriza in its government, on the other hand, on one hand, tried and actually achieved to exhaust the distributive and the quality elements within the parametric solutions of the current system, and introduced the maximum element of fairness in the current system, and also took part of the welfare state, which is the health coverage, and provided a universal coverage to the whole of the population, also immigrants and so on. So it is within the scope, and we had significant wins in that period, but we didn't enjoy both the time and also the conditions, the political conditions to go that step further. If we would go that step further, then we would need also to achieve the social alliances that would go with that. And my argument would be that the fact that we missed the opportunity to do that is a significant element of costing the election, the last election, in the sense that it's not taxes that affect the unemployed, pensioners, self-employed with minimum income or little income and so on, but contributions to their pension plans and so on were a more significant part of their income, and it was a more important for them because it was something that they were experiencing every month in a significant way. Although the media focused and the agenda focused on the tax issue, I think that the pension issue is an issue that can bring together the unemployed, the self-employed workers because of the time reduction, even small and medium enterprise owners, family businesses and so on, in a social alliance that will give us the opportunity to change the conditions of employment and also create a new biopolitics, because in the end, what we are seeking is not just an economistic solution, but an attempt to reach a new condition that will not just defend the past, which we had so many barriers to do, but also to pursue radical policies that will address the challenges of the technological revolutions. So I would say that in our next attempt, we have to also to build that prospect that, if I remember well, Aristides Baltas and other speakers talked about in the morning sessions, that it's not just of running government, running the state, but also creating the prospects on which we will build your hegemony, political and ideological, and your government period. Thank you. I hope I didn't overrun my time.
Thank you very much, Professor Stamboulis, for this presentation in a very crucial issue concerning the pension system and the left policy in government. So, unfortunately, we don't have time now for a discussion, even though for some comments that I would like to make. I invite you to the whole discussion for the concluding comments of all today sessions right now, immediately in the concluding session. Thank you very much for your presentations.
You're welcome.
Welcome again to our last session for today. I am Nicos Poulantzas, and I will be coordinating this final panel, discussing with these day speakers some questions and conclusions. I will not, of course, summarize the whole discussion today. Besides, we had 4 rich sessions on the most important aspects of the Syriza experience, as well as on the relation between this experience and the left theory. During the day, several questions have been raised by the audience that followed us. Some of them are too special to discuss in this panel. The others I will include to my remarks in order to begin the discussion among us. I have with me tonight Costas Douzinas, the president of MPI and professor in the University of London, Elias Georgadas, associate professor at the University of Crete, Lois Labrianidis, professor at the University of Macedonia and former Secretary General for Private Investments, Giorgos Taboulis, associate professor at the University of Thessaly, Maria Karamessini, professor at the Pantheon University and ex-governor of the Greek Public Employment Agency, and Peter Bratis, associate professor at the City University of New York. I will make some general remarks, as I said, and then we will discuss among us. The first remark I think we could propose after today's session is that a left theory, as many of our contributors pointed out, and especially Costas Douzinas, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and Aristidis Baltas in the first panel, is essential for properly preparing for government. And conversely, experiences from different countries, especially in the European South, could and should be generalized in order to renew left theory. Second idea, the role of left-wing think tanks in concretely analyzing different economic, social, political issues and providing the means for an evidence-based policymaking is also essential. It is thus a good thing that we are discussing in a conference co-organized by 2 such think tanks, a Greek and a European one. Third point, all speakers pointed out the successes of Syriza government in their respective fields, as well as the obstacles it met and sometimes its own inadequacies. Some of them are rather structural and are inherent to capitalism and the capitalist state, the architecture of the EU, etc. Others, however, can be fixed. Such examples are, for instance, the lack of roots of Syriza in trade unions, pointed out by Efi Achtioglu in the previous panel, or the fear to politicize the democratic reforms or to impose popular sovereignty to markets, as Peter Bratis and myself said in 2 panels before. In view of this new period, Syriza and the rest of the European left should discuss these successes and the obstacles and inadequacies and rethink their strategies. For Syriza, it is important that it collectively adopted a document on its government period, which is expected to appear soon in English as well, so I think it will be a valuable tool for further reading and discussion. Fourth point, no one contests the efforts of Syriza on humanitarian crisis, on fighting poverty, on diminishing unemployment, providing social protect, etc. All our speakers pointed out these efforts through public spending. I now recall the speeches of Euclid Tsakalotos, Efi Achtioglu, Petros Linardos Rimon, Maria Karamessini, and maybe others that I'm right now forgetting. However, what is equally, if not more important in the long run, are structural reforms in the development plan and the industrial strategy that Lois Labrianidis explained, in the field of social economy, cooperatives and the commons, in the labor market, in the democratic institutions and the state, etc. Fifth point, although the experience of Syriza was exceptional and it took place in turbulent circumstances, it seems that we have much to learn from it, as we also have much to learn by the similar experiences of the left in the rest of the European South. The current COVID-19 crisis might be of a different kind than than the economic crisis of the previous decade. However, it poses similar threats and it attacks in similar ways labor, public goods, democracy, etc. And on the other hand, it opens similar potential for the left and poses questions that might open the discussion of a different pathway of a transformation of the production and consumption paradigm and so on. So, in the light of the above remarks, I have to bring to you 4 questions by our audience that, in my view, have a broader value. But of course, you are also free to comment anything you find interesting. The first question is about competitiveness and whether this is an inherent, inevitable objective in microeconomics, or we can think beyond this. The second is about the strategies that the left should employ to cope with technological advances, and more specifically, the role of digital platforms and the legislation and strategy employed by the EU on this matter. The third question, more focused on the Syriza experience, is why, in your view, did Syriza lose support of the social movement after its rise to government? And what are its intentions now? Is the party willing to engage again in the social movements, or this relation is over? And the last question, as we are in a conference titled Left Theory for the 21st Century, what utopia is proposed by Syriza right now? And let me add, it was not the question of our follower, what utopia is generally proposed by the left in Europe and globally? So, Costas, I know you have to leave us earlier. So, do you want to begin, to be the one to begin with?
Thank you very much, Danai. And let me start by thanking Michalis, you, Danai, and of course all our colleagues in the Institute, Katerina and Mario and Sotiris, and everyone else who have, I think, done extremely well over the last few days. It was a difficult, I think, undertaking, and certainly with only the few problems we had in the very first session, it went very well. So thank you all, but particularly the 2 directors, Danai and Michalis put an extremely hard, I think, hard work, for this to succeed. I just want to make a very quick point, and I have to go and teach in half an hour. The point is that it seems to me the great success of this conference the first day was that precisely every single person who spoke brought together their theoretical positions with a part of political experience. And I think what we all agreed from slightly different perspectives was that there was a problem with the structural reforms, as Euclid called them. I call them transformational, transformative reforms. And of course, Danai, you mentioned extensively the democratic reforms that we carried out. And it is, I think, a common view from all the points made by colleagues that while on the economic front, with the huge constraints that the structural adjustment program, the third program that Syriza accepted, the macroeconomic policy created space for dealing with the crisis, the humanitarian crisis, for a good redistribution. Not huge, but I mean, very good in the circumstances. On the side of reforms, whether they were working rights and working conditions reforms that, of course, Efi Akçoğlu mentioned at great length, or the democratic reforms that you went through one after the other, sort of in great detail, and which were opening space for a greater advance in the future. Unfortunately, we failed. And I can say, from my perspective, as someone who was involved very much with the constitutional reform, presenting it with George Kartrougalos in Parliament, I was really shocked by the way in which all this work was just just disappeared without a murmur. And I think here we have certain lessons. There are lessons that we have to learn about the next stage. Because as a left party, a left government, a political program that aims at a gradual transformation towards democratic socialism, I think it is important to understand and to prepare so that any reforms that we may try to plan and to introduce in the second time, the second coming, as it were, if it happens, will have to be, I think, much more prepared, and we have to address the public before we start moving, so that we have created a much more fertile soil. I think that you used that expression, that somehow people did not follow. We opened the space, people did not follow. We have to start preparing those steps well in advance. No reform, even the most advanced, the most radical, as Michalis Bartsidis, was, I think, alluding to, can succeed if you cannot carry with you not just the social movements, but also the public opinion more generally, and some of the influencers of public opinion who were so important in totally undermining some of our more democratic reforms. So again, thank you very much. I think I've learned quite a lot today. I'm leaving this session tonight, much wiser, if that can happen to an old bloke like me. But thank you very much, because you all been extremely, extremely good today. And I think we have a much better understanding of what went right and what went wrong, and lessons for the first time.
Thank you, Costas. I think I will follow the series of the panels of today, because I know that those that spoke in the morning are rather tired, and I am going to give the floor to Lois Labrianidis for a short comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Danai. I would like to make comments on 3 issues. The one is that I think that we have to bring into the picture the importance of the state and the lack of the ability of the state to cope with lots of things that we are facing, where we are trying to formulate policies. The lack that has been mentioned, and you mentioned it, Danai, of evidence-based policy, or the lack of thinking capacity, is something that we faced, during the Syriza government all the time. That we didn't know what exactly to do and what are the issues at stake all the time. So when you were formulating policies, you had limits. The one thing is, that's the one thing. The other thing is regarding the 2 questions that have been raised by the audience, competitors and digital platforms. I think that living in a globalized economy, we have to understand that there is some sort of international division of labor. And the people, the countries, the companies, the people that they are involved in the production of higher value added products, they are reaping the benefits out of that. So knowing that the production of higher value products and services is the one that gives more benefits to the people, I suppose that what we have to do is try to move the whole economy, or our economy, along the value chains, so as to produce more of these products, that is, products with higher value added. And the final thing that I would like to mention concerns the digital platforms. As I mentioned, the digital platforms are very important. They enjoy a monopoly situation in many sectors, and this creates a lot of problems. One of the problems that they create, of course, they contribute to the exaggeration of the income inequalities, that's for sure, and the monopolization of the market. But one other thing that we have to take into account is that they slow down the rate of innovation. And how they do that? They do that by acquiring potential competitors, and the other way is by competing in a marketplace that they own. Let's say Amazon. I mean, they own the market and they are competing at the same time. I would like to stress, I mean, this acquiring potential competitors that we face all the time and in Greece. I mean, we hear of some startups in Greece that they made it and they have been acquired by huge companies. I must say that this is very good. I mean, for the people, I mean, that they own this startup, that they are going to get lots of money out of that. But at the same time, it creates lots of problem. I mean, to the process of innovation within the country. And I think that we have to have this in mind. And the last thing that I would like to point out concerning the digital companies is that these online outsourcing platforms, that they have created a global labor market, this in a sense brings benefits, I mean, to the less developed countries, but on the other hand, it's a trap. It's a trap both for the developed countries and the less developed countries, because they lead us to the race to the bottom. So we have to deal with these things and to try to formulate policies so as to limit the power of these companies and support, I mean, the freelancers and the small and medium-sized enterprises, so as to be able to somehow compete with these platforms.
Thank you, Lois. Welcome, Aristidis. We have now Aristidis Baltas in our company. He's Professor Emeritus of the National Technical University of Athens and former minister during the Syriza government. I am sure that Giorgos Staboulis and Maria Kramessini will have many to comment on what Lois just said, because I know these topics also interest them. But I have to live up to my promise to let people that spoke first go first. And I know that we woke Peter Bratis very early in the morning in order to participate to our panel. So, Peter, would you like to take the floor for some comment?
Yes, thank you. I think this is part of the training too, the revolutionary training. We have to be ready any time of the day, because the revolution can happen any minute. And the counter-revolution, they will plan early in the morning because they think, oh, the Marxists, they sleep until noon and then they need 6 espressos to wake up. So this is part of, I think, the good thinking on behalf of the Institute to plan for the odd hours of participation. I mean, let me just say to begin with that I don't think a left goal, a left telos for politics can be economic growth, increased employment, or any such thing. It is a practical necessity given the current situation. But I think one thing that the pandemic exposes is just how banal, just how meaningless the dilemma is between risking your life for work or trying to stay alive for what? To be able to then once again participate in the labor market, in work and so forth. I mean, what is the purpose of being alive if the fundamental activity is to make money, to be able to exist, and then the liberal ideology in liberal society has as its goal life, liberty, property, as we know. Property, of course, being foremost of those three. So I don't think we can have the same goals as the liberal world, that the preservation of life and property are first and foremost. And this is to go back to my talk from before, I think, is a fundamental weakness in the Syriza experience, in that we were so caught up in austerity, in the financial crisis. We did not put forth some value, some ethic beyond self-interests, beyond reducing economic suffering, as a principle around which to mobilize and organize. It's not just the institutional links to the labor movement and various social movements. There has to be, I think, some ethic beyond self-preservation. That's why I mentioned before the experience of Glezos and others. You know, of course, it is because we're not just animals, obviously. You know, we are more than, or we're a particular type of animal, at least, that rises beyond the level of biological life. And if the fear of death is so great that it immobilizes us. I mean, just think in terms of the economic question. At the depths of the economic crisis in Greece, economic activity, GDP, never fell below the levels of 2001. Now, 2001 in Greece, levels of consumption were more than sufficient. The way the crisis happened, it was not equally shared, let's say, the economic contractions. But in terms of total activity, in 2001, it was fine. In 2011, it wasn't fine. But it's not to say that, well, without growth, people will be miserable, or it is a catastrophe. It is only a catastrophe given certain liberal tendencies. On this question of technology and the hope for the future, I think we're all the time in a somewhat more difficult situation. The technology in some ways, of course, greatly enhances our capacities, you know, like having this conference today. On the other hand, it makes even deeper a broader transformation that's been taking place in the context of Fordist capitalism. You know, when Freud published Civilization and Its Discontents, the assumption was, and Freud's argument was, that when you limit sexual activity, when you limit sexuality, that energy, that libidinal drive is displaced onto social activities. And the function is then to bind the members of the community together in a stronger way so as to create a cohesive political community. Today, because of the rise of Fordist consumer capitalism, many of these libidinal displacements are no longer in social activity that bind us together as a group, as a cohesive unity, but is individualized in forms of consumption. So the communal bonds become weaker and more brittle. People become more and more alienated and isolated and politically incapable. And this is something I think a left organization like Syriza has to contend with. You know, Syriza has to embrace its nature as a political party in the full Gramscian sense, I think, and educate, create new sensibilities, as we talked about, you know, before with war of maneuvers and so forth. This is really a fundamental and deep problem that has to be addressed. And the technology is not, as it presently exists, is not helping the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your remarks. I think you opened a bit the discussion also about the perspectives and the question of what utopia can the left propose. So if the rest of the panel does not object, I would like to give the floor to Aristidis because he has to go to a party obligation. You know, Costas said that we have all theoretical views and political experience, so he has to perform his duties. Aristidis, you have the floor. Unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I have to leave. The one is a comment about the conference as going so far from what I understood. I think it's quite important in many ways, especially since we are trying, most of the speakers, from what I gather, try to do something like the following. To reach the level of theory, let's say, and then start about the future of the left and all that, you have to take into account that the experiences of the participants are different, and especially if they are coming from different countries, which means that the particular experiences have somehow first to be presented as such, with a minimum of theory, so to speak, and then afterwards, taking them all into account to start speaking about the future of the left, the situation generally, and things like that. I'm saying this because the Syriza experience, so to speak, is quite particular to Greece, quite particular to particular circumstances, the social structure of Greece, the role of the state in Greece, the history of the left in Greece, and things like that, which are not shared by other countries. This, from what I have gathered, goes well. We have to take this into account to go a step forward. At the second level, the general comment following this idea of what the future of the left should be, what the utopia we could present nowadays, I think we're continuing more or less on the previous line. We have to think of something quite different. We have to think of what the future for the world appears to be, given this crisis. I mean, this is a world which is being prepared right now from all powers in place. It will be a different world, and no power in place can predict what the world will be, although they are preparing for it. Because you have, as it were, the perfect storm now at the moment. You have on the one hand the pandemic, all the problems of the third wave of the national health systems around the world, the class difference among the victims of the pandemic and all that, while at the same time the pandemic is a life-threatening thing for everybody. Second, you have the climate crisis, which, do not forget, relates to the previous one and offers us, let's say, the opportunity, so to speak, to think of ecology in different terms than we used to do up to now. It's much more basic, much more fundamental, connects with what is common, with the water becoming more expensive, so to speak, and all that. Third, we have the economic crisis hitting all countries, different degrees, with different governments acting differently in respect to the deepening crisis, social dissolution of the middle class in many countries, and on top of that, you have all the how can I say, all the international relations in jeopardy, both regarding the big powers, the United States and its crisis, Europe, where it's going, China, what it wants to do, Russia. In Greece, we have Turkey in addition to all that. And this is a new, world stage, so to speak, with many, many aspects. At this level, what I think summarizes the whole thing is that the whole civilization of capital, the civilization of capitalism, the whole of it, is at the deepest of its crisis ever. And of course, it is trying to restore itself, to rework in the new conditions and all that, which means that the left should, I think, on the basis of its experience, on the basis of thinking of its history, on the basis of the analysis of the present situation, start to speak correctly with the new idea of socialism, but start to speak of socialism in positive terms. This is the utopia, I think, we are mentioning. Speak in positive terms, concrete terms as far as it can go, as this can go given our experiences and the analysis of the situation, and start not to be, so to speak, on the defensive. Start to say that this world is not livable in the literal sense, in the most literal sense. It's not livable at the level of life itself, pandemic, at the level of the planet, the climate crisis, at the level of societies having a kind of unity within them without sending away most of the members. And this can only be an idea of socialism which is old and new. From this point of view, the task of the left is to make concrete what this new idea of socialism can be. This, I think, could be a kind of idea which already, according to me, governs this conference, which can be made precise after its end, and which will allow us to continue a discussion across borders, all the way, borders within Europe, borders of Europe with other countries and all that, at the level of having a common goal, which is a planetary idea of socialism, if I may speak that in those, let's say, very utopian terms. But utopia can be made real. Thank you.
Thank you, Aristidis, and for the optimistic conclusion. I have a task to assign and a favor to ask from Elias. Would you agree to go last and try and wrap up the conversation after Maria and Yorgos? If so, I think I can.
No problem. Yeah.
I thought that you were the one who presented a more, let's say, general idea of the experience, so it falls to you to wrap up the discussion. Maria, do you want to take the floor for a short comment?
You will excuse me myself, I have to leave, unfortunately.
Yes.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, so I can start. I'm a little puzzled. I want to start from something that it's very important for me because, and I mentioned it in my presentation. Unfortunately, I had some lessons gives lessons at the university. I didn't follow the panel on the state and the theory of the state, where Elias and Danai participated, and Peter as well, I think, if I'm correct. So I missed this session, but I think that the whole issue is very, very important from the strategy of the left, and if we are considering in Greece of taking the second time power, if things are conducive to change in the balance of forces and the opinion in the electorate. So I think that we have to be more concrete on what we are planning to do next time, because I find that we have a terrible lack of understanding of what was going on in the state. And we didn't have an idea of how we should transform the state. And we didn't have a vision about how the state should be and what the role of the employees, of the public servants should be, and how we would make them participate in a project of social transformation and the role of civil servants. I can capitalize my experience in OIF, and I mentioned it in my presentation because it was a revelation for me, a real revelation of me, because we had to push forward the reform, which was a conditionality of the memorandum of understanding. So we had at the same time to try to deconstruct the neoliberal direction and reconstruct our on our own vision, taking into account the modernization elements that were already included in the neoliberal project. So we had to deconstruct and reconstruct according to a left project of transformation of the agency. Okay, so it was a very, very difficult thing to do, and we have also to gain support from the base of 5,000 employees who were asked to go towards a neoliberal reform of the organization. So we had to change the minds of people, of workers, of employees. It was a huge task to undertake in order to give the directions, both at the ideological and the value of and the role of the public service and the role of the link of the public service with the people and the citizens and their own needs, etc., etc. So it was an ideological struggle. Let me say, which gave to me a big experience in how to reach people who are the public servants who we take for granted that they don't do their job, they are lazy, perhaps they are not interested, etc., etc. So I went at the basis and to understand why they were not confident in the direction, in the leadership, in the management. Why, and how to link the strategy of the left with their own working experience, but their own value system. And this was a very difficult task, but it has helped me to gain a very, very important experience of how we should work with the public service and how we should gain support and we should change the state and the functions of the state, but also the mindset of people working in the public service. So I think that if we don't question the way of how unions act, of what tools we have for management in order to handle the everyday working of the state, etc. If we don't seriously theorize of what should be a transformation of the state from a left point of view, I think that we will never succeed, even if we get to government for the second time. So I think we should put much effort to analyze and then to find a strategy, a left strategy, to prepare the project of the left to govern for a second time. Okay. This is one thing that I wanted to stress. The second thing I wanted to stress is about the welfare state. Syriza government has given priority to labor relations, the welfare state, social rights, etc., because it's normal, because it represents the interests of the working classes, of all dominated classes and groups, etc. So it is the distinctive role of a left party to protect these interests. Nevertheless, the whole theory of the welfare state has shown that, Marxist also writers and thinkers have stressed the double function of the state, and the double function of the state, which is to in capitalist societies, this is to help to assist the accumulation of capital, and at the same time to integrate redistributive elements and promote social rights in order to integrate the dominated classes in the political compromise. So these thinkers, Marxist thinkers, have underlined this double function of accumulation and legitimacy for the welfare state. I think that we can not proceed in advancing social rights unless we, in Greece and in other countries, we think about how the accumulation of capital should be transformed, in what ways, but also in ways to provide the sustainability of societies in terms of full employment, etc., which are the prerequisite for having robust welfare states and welfare states that protect and promote further the social rights for citizens. So I think that the question raised by Danai, if competitiveness is, what did you say, Danai? If it is
a necessary objective.
This is an objective. I would say that competition is a basic feature of the capitalist system, but the definitions of competitiveness are very different. Very, very, very different. I don't think that society could and the country could resist would afford to maintain its living standard without placing itself in the international division of labor and the competition which is between different nation states, different blocks, etc., etc. So we couldn't discard the problem of competitiveness, but we should place ourselves in a kind of policies that serve particular definitions of competitiveness, which are based on the parallel development of social rights and productivity, which could be the combination that would promote social well-being at the same time with economic well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Now we have strictly 8 minutes remaining, so I will ask for a short comment by Yorgos, and then we will conclude with Ilias. Yorgos, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will say that the 4 questions, I think, go into dimensions. The first dimension is the dimension of digitalization and competitiveness and so on. And the other one is the one of sustainability, and especially in the terms that Aristidis and Peter said it. So I would say that the fallacy, the neoliberal fallacy, that you can go on competitiveness without being sustainable. And it's more evident now, not only because of the crisis COVID, which is a second crisis of values. And I think that what also Peter said, that also the first here, the fiscal crisis was not just a fiscal crisis; it was a crisis of values, and we did see people coming together in the movements, in the solidarity movement, and so on. But our failure, I would say, was to translate that in a positive dialectic, in setting up a new agenda, and that's where the element of utopia was missing. So I would say very shortly that this, first of all, the digitalization, as we call it, process, it's a process of transformation which falls onto the transformation of the process of creation of value, extraction of value, and distribution of value. And it's not anymore, as Maria said, a competition on resources. I would say it's a competition on a war on talents. The second issue is that this transformation has obvious political elements. And we could first of all look at Merkel and her response to the attempt by the platforms to silence Trump, and her worriness about how the state should, and in that sense, democracy should keep that prerogative and not the private platform. So I would say that there is an element of too much success, but the deepest transformation, I think, is that one that we could understand if we look at Polanyi. I think we are going through a second great transformation from the beginning of the 1970s, and we can see now more clearly all the elements: the political, the production, the economic, and we are going at the second attempt of the society of the market, and a second attempt to throw out a large part of society and the planet. And in order to respond to that, we have to create our own positive agenda. My fear is, and as we were discussing in the previous panel, that was drawn in my mind, we shouldn't be afraid to be unrealistic, to be radical, because only if you are radical, you're realistic. I would say in the short answer to utopia is we should talk about Star Trek instead of Mad Max, and draw on that comparison. And the other element is that in that process, we should draw out the fact that there are inherent antitheses in the neoliberal narrative. We want to compete against each other, for instance, on yesterday's news in Greece, for education. But on the other hand, competitiveness relies on all of us being educated, not a few of us being educated. Health, we discovered by COVID, relies on everybody being healthy. You can't have a few of us healthy and the others transmitting a disease. And the same goes for the environment. So we have sort of in this great second multiple transition period, windows of opportunity. But we need to understand, in order to do that, we have to address the movements in a new way. What we lost in the movements was the opportunity to build on the social capital that was built on solidarity and give a new agenda. My mind always goes back to Mondragon. In an age of crisis, in famine, what they did was to go back to the roots of the labor movement, which is not just unions, it was also cooperatives. It was a solidarity economy. We failed to do that. We looked only at defending the Fordist regime of industrial relationships and not attacking to the new sort of Star Trek cooperative economy. And the knowledge economy is an economy that provides for this second attempt. I would say we have a Basque village to look up, like we have at the Gauloise village of Asteris. And this is the knowledge economy of the future. This is our new Mecca of the left. We have an example there, and we have where we have to go now and look for our utopia in action. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgios. Ilias, do you want to have the floor for the concluding remarks?
Yeah. Okay. Let me put the ribbon around the wrapping paper. Okay, 4 remarks will be very brief. We'll try to concentrate different ideas that were expressed during this first day of this very interesting conference. Remark number 1, the trap of governmentalism, κυβερνητισμός, there's no better term. That was a trap that the Syriza did not manage to avoid. This explains also the crucial question, why did Syriza lose social movement support? It lost social movement support because it stopped communicating with the social movements, with the social base. Why did it do so? It did so because the transition to power, the ascent to power, always has a cost. Syriza did not avoid falling into this trap of governmentalism. and it paid the price. So lesson number one, a better balance between government responsibilities and keeping the communication channels open with the society as a whole, especially social movements and those that are at the forefront, the vanguard of social change. Remark number two, we made the mistake to limit our view of our political program and saw the left as a machine of social repair. Certainly, social repairs were much needed and they were carried out and very successfully, I would say. Maria and Effie would, I suppose, second this opinion, especially in their fields, in the field of social rights, where there were many, many advances. However, it seems that public opinion in general, the society, social classes, especially the exploited social classes, expect something more, not only a left as a mechanism of social repair. We didn't manage to go beyond that. It's never enough to clear the mess. You have to go beyond that at the point of creation, of making something new, of giving a new vision. Remark number three, I think that there was a conflation. We more or less thought in Syriza that if we achieved good policy performance indicators, then we would automatically achieve good electoral performance indicators. That was a problem. In policy performance, I think that by the people that I talked to, most of them, well-meaning people, congratulate Syriza. They say that the Syriza government was one of the best governments that the country ever had, honest, meritocratic, and so on. And the policy performance scores very high. However, this policy performance does not automatically translate into electoral performance. And this is an area that we have to look at. The transition from one to the other is not automatic, and we have to look at the peculiarities that are in between the two. And the final remark, I cannot stress more than what has already been stressed by Baltas and by Bratis. We have to win the battle of ideas. We need new ideas, and of course, the Institute, Nicos Poulantzas Institute, Transform, other players in the field are very important in carrying out this task. We have to win the battle of ideas. The ideas that seem to attract the imagination of the people are rapidly changing, and I think that there is a lot of way to run and catch the targets. We have fallen behind. The digital commons are changing. The climate problems are aggravated day by day, and I think that this also raises the question of what party we need, which is also a big discussion. There will be, of course, the party procedures in a couple of months' time, I think, where a big discussion must take place of what kind of party is needed to carry out all these very important tasks for the future and for the perspectives of the left to govern again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ilya.
A remark for you.
No, I won't make any remarks because we are way past our closing time. We will wrap up for today. Tomorrow, for our audience, we start the second day of the conference at 11:45 Athens, 10:45. I'm sorry, Athens time. We will be discussing about the living in dark times and left politics. So thank you all and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you. Good night.